This
Okay.
conference will now be recorded.
Yes, can see that. Okay, thanks, Arrmeila.
Perfect, thank you. Cool. So to give a bit of context as to sort of how it came about, I did a piece of work around renewables during my year in industry, and part of that project, I came across another work stream that developed a design standard for developing an off-grid power supply for an OMSL, so an overlay miniature stoplight, which is essentially a system that you can put onto a passive crossing that's not necessarily interlocked. And the standard included a recommended architecture that was a combination of potentially using a fuel cell, PV, or wind turbine. And at the time, there was a combination on trial that used a PV and fuel cell, which I'll be referring to as the base solution. And this sparked as an interest to look into the renewable option, so the wind and PV combination. And since that, I developed the alternative solution using the same standard, and did a whole life cost analysis on both solutions on a single installation scenario, so installing it on a case study location, and a network-wide scenario where I looked into the impact across installing them across the network. And this made a dissertation and subsequently a paper. And since that piece of work was done, the power supply that was on trial is now a full product approved combination. And as well as that, the template design is also fully product approved, so you can now build to design as opposed to building to approval. So what was the relevance of doing this? So I came across a statement that highlighted some aspirational goals for level crossings, and one of them stated equipping all passive crossings with some sort of protection by 2039. And by passive crossing, I mean a crossing that doesn't have sort of any active protection on it. And with 2039 being fairly close, I thought that was quite an interesting target. And as well as that, there was an Outcome update. So Outcome is the all level crossings risk model. And it's essentially a database that includes all safety information about level crossings on the network, and it's heavily used for long-term financial modelling. And this was recently updated with more recent and more reliable data, where previously it stated that automatic half barriers were the riskiest crossings in the network. But since that update, it actually says it's the passive crossings that pose the most risk. So that's an even more push to achieve the goal above. And that obviously leads to the obvious question of why they exist in the first place. And primarily it's because of how remote they are. So a lot of these passive crossings are significant distances from their DNO. So you incur a lot of costs from cabling alone. And with the low usage of those crossings, the sort of incentive to power those crossings have been quite weak in terms of business case. So this is definitely a problem that will benefit from developing a cheap power supply solution. So before going into the two whole life cost analysis that I did, I think it's important to sort of introduce the sort of tools that I used. So for the individual scenarios, I used HomoPro, which is an industry accepted software, and it's heavily used in the renewables industry, and it essentially runs a feasibility and life cycle cost on specific locations, where there are parameters built into the software that help incentivize the use of renewables. And then I used Outcome, which I introduced in the previous slide, to run a whole life cost analysis on a wider installation scenario to assess the impact across the network. And I used Outcome to include an additional parameter called the safety risk cost. And that's quite heavily used in long-term planning, and like Homer that incentivizes to use renewables, it's used to incentivize using the safest option when considering different solutions. So what was the lead up to doing the two analysis? So the first thing, of course, I had to do was develop the alternative solution. And to do that, I followed the standard that was used to develop the base solution. And the standard essentially walks you through quite a thorough feasibility study using an off-grid sizing tool that was developed as part of it. And it helps with developing an optimal combination for your chosen location. And in this case, it turned out to be a wind turbine and 2 PVs. And once I had the two options to compare, I did a whole life cost analysis on an installation on a single location, which in this case turned out to be a passive crossing in Carmarthenshire, Wales. And then I did the same, but modeling both solutions on a multiple installation scenario. So I recreated installation across all passive crossings and footpaths on the network. So this is just a snippet of the outcome of the off-grid sizing tool in the standard. And essentially what it lets you do is it lets you input the specifics of each part of the component. It lets you put in the load and the specific of the location. So you could put in the solar, you download the solar resource, conduct any shading assessments, etc. And then the tool would then tell you whether that combination will provide enough power for that location, as well as showing you what parts of the system will be working at different seasons. So the methods for the two types of whole life costing, they were quite similar. So both of them were for a duration of 20 years, with capital and maintenance being the main parameters. The main differences were, of course, the number of installations. And in the whole life costing on outcome, there was an additional safety risk cost as well. So we also had to make some assumptions to keep the analysis consistent, because at the time the proposed solution, of course, was still theoretical and there was limited information about the system as a whole. So maintenance was based on labour hours, asset degradation was sort of used as recommended by HOMA, and reactive maintenance wasn't considered. In outcome, it's also important to mention that the cost of no intervention was also considered, just for the basis of comparing safety risk cost. And it was also assumed that introducing a miniature stoplight at a crossing would reduce the risk by 90%. So here are some of the snips of the simulations that were done. So the top two are from HOMA. So what HOMA does is that you put in all the components of both solutions individually with all the specifics of the engineering characteristics. You put in the electrical load that you require, as well as the location that's going to be installed on. And HOMA will then output all the feasible combinations that work for that location, and it ranks them in terms of best net present cost, which we're interchangeably using as whole life cost. And interestingly, the proposed solutions, the renewable combination, actually came out of first, but the base system, so what was product approved, it actually came in as a close second. So that was quite interesting to see. And then in the bottom two, those were the calculations done on HOMA. So as you can see, there was a total safety risk cost and maintenance for both solutions, and the same was done for no intervention as well, so leaving the crossing as it is. So the results. So both analysis showed the renewable or proposed to have a better net present cost, as also known as whole life cost. As you see in HOMA, you can see that the base solution decreased massively and ended up with a negative whole life cost. And that was mainly because the fuel cell required regular maintenance in terms of refueling. And HOMA also has built-in penalties. So because the software is strictly comparative, if a system is less renewable than the system it's being compared to, HOMA adds penalties to sort of influence the decision to the more renewable option. Outcome showed the same. It showed that the renewable solution had a better whole life cost. But when looking at more riskier crossings, the gap sort of closed, and it came to a difference of only about 3 million, which in a nationwide perspective, you could see that as negligible. So the conclusions that came out of that, so if we were to discuss the methods, you wouldn't be able to group them as the same, but with the method used by Homer, it'll be useful to use it on more of an individual basis and to get more of an environmental perspective, whereas the whole life cost calculator on outcome is more for seeing the bigger picture and long-term planning. However, both results do say that if an area has a good wind and solar resource, you could fairly confidently say that the renewable solution will have a good whole life cost long term, and it's worth developing to be an available option, which since has happened. And we can also say on the basis of the outcome results that the base solution is sufficient for an area that doesn't have good wind or solar, just simply on the basis of the fact that the safety risk cost does reduce, and it doesn't reduce, isn't as high as the proposed. However, this does pose the question of why renewable and sustainability isn't really focused on in terms of decision making. So current standards and policies would say both are just as suitable, just simply because there isn't really a financial weighting on that. So there's always the question of whether that should be included in the hierarchy, where safety, of course, comes first, but could renewables and sustainability come as a close second, which is something that was thought about at the end of that. And yeah, finally, what more could be done? So I guess the next step would be including, well, because both solutions are available now, including them as an intervention option in level crossing models for long-term planning. This way, the saving and the impact could be used for the future. And as well as that, it could open up the potential of using it for other assets. And there's actually been some interest and ideas to sort of replace some battery powered assets with off-grid. So this is definitely something to develop. And finally, there might also be some worth looking into off-grid versus grid. So there could be some areas that don't have the issue of remoteness, but it might be better off that off-grid is actually cheaper and easier to run. So that's also something that's worth exploring. And yeah, that was me. Thank you for listening. And I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Arrmeila. While we wait for any questions to arrive, you mentioned at the end there about the technology being applied to other assets. What sort of discussions have you had with other parts of the TA or route businesses about those applications?
Yeah, good question. So there was, I think it was Wales and Western who were considering using it for a battery powered gate that they had, not on line side, but it's been sort of considered that maybe it might be easier to have an off-grid power supply, because with the battery they've had a lot of need for regular maintenance, whereas with an off-grid power supply, if it works, you can sort of plug in and play, if that makes sense. So that's sort of been the ideas being discussed so far.
Well, it's really good work, and interesting how you combine the sort of the sustainability risk assessment with the safety risk assessment as well through that exercise. So I think, as you say at the end of your presentation, we've got something to learn from that example in terms of how we combine those two requirements in future with all that we do.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that example, Arrmeila. So I've got a question here from Peter Halliwell. So it was a great presentation, Arrmeila. What do you know about field applications and gaining real life costs from the examples that you've taken us through today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was sort of looking into the alternative theoretical option, some of the things that were like really important to think about that I didn't have the information was the maintenance of the wind turbine. So in reality, there's obviously a lot more to it than just sticking it into the ground. There's definitely maintenance around the blades and regular bearing changes that we don't know much about, because the railway hasn't really used it for that application. And there's also the issue of like working at height. So of course, the higher the wind turbine is, the more wind that you'll get, but we're obviously limited in terms of clearances required for OLE and just working at height regulations. So implementing the sort of renewable side, there's definitely more to think about in terms of actually getting it on site.
Great, thank you, Arrmeila. Don't see any more questions just yet, so we'll move on. Thanks for that presentation, really great. And if any more questions come in during the rest of today's session, we'll perhaps come back to them towards at the end. So we'll move on now to our next presenter. This is Saloni Chaudhary, and Saloni is going to talk to us about understanding safety-driven changes at Network Rail and her perspective on this topic, which is going to be really interesting. So welcome, Saloni, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Gareth. So as Gareth said, my name is Saloni. I'm a graduate electrical engineer at Network Rail. I'm based in the technical authority, and I'm in the signalling field. I studied electrical and electronic engineering at Nottingham, and I also did a year in industry at Network Rail, which is where I realised that I want to be in the rail industry. And I'll just share my screen. See. Yep. Can everyone see my screen clearly?
Yes, thanks, Saloni.
Right, okay, perfect. So as Gareth said, the topic of my presentation is understanding safety-driven changes at Network Rail. I also had Mohammed Gilani help me out with the presentation because it's a topic that he was interested in too. He's a year in industry student at Network Rail, but he couldn't come for the event to help me out with presenting, but I thought I'll put his name in too. Sorry, my laptop's acting up today. So my presentation is about understanding safety. So I'm going to talk about how we manage safety at Network Rail and some of the things that impact that. I'm also going to talk about an example of one such impact in terms of shift working trends and their implications. And then I'm going to go into some grim stuff of understanding what happens when we fail at safety and what Network Rail is doing about it in terms of any strategies that are being implemented. And finally, I'm going to talk about what the future of Network Rail will look like in terms of running a safe railway for all our people and our track workers as well as our passengers. So in terms of how we manage safety, there are various teams that work with each other to look after people, whether they're track workers or passengers. Some teams include the Health and Safety and Environment team, which manages the guidance framework to drive sustainable and safe improvements on the railway. It's a national team and it's based on the Technical Authority. And there's also the Workforce Safety team, which looks after Network Rail's workflows and manages tools like Safe System Work Pack, or as well as any fatigue management tools that are involved. There's also the Safety Task Force team, which is a project-based team that is working at improving safety at Network Rail by improving the risks that are associated with open line working, as well as removing any lookout of working that happens on our railway to make sure that our track workers are safe. There are also route health and safety teams, and these are teams that act as a link between the Technical Authority, which sits at a national level, as well as route-based teams, and they act as a link in delivering key projects. Then in terms of the culture of safety, the first thing is that we all understand that you're responsible for your own safety, and that leads to a positive culture, which means that it's okay to say no to a task if you don't feel like you can do it, which is really good for graduates like me who are new to the business, because I feel safe when I'm doing things because I know that if I don't feel comfortable with it, I can say no. We're also governed by life-saving rules, which are a set of 10 rules that help us be safe, and apart from that, there are constant conversations around safety. This can happen through safety bulletins or safety hour meetings, where you can talk about a wide range of topics and how they impact the health and safety in a particular situation. So we do a lot, and we try to manage a lot of interfaces, but obviously there are a lot of things that also impact the safety of a particular situation. So this could be in terms of unsafe practices, so maybe cutting corners, getting a job done quickly, and that could be because you want to go home, or because there's a culture of appreciating people who do a 4-hour job in 2 hours, because that could mean that there are hazards that the railway has been exposed to, because if it's a 4-hour job, then it should be done in that time frame. There could also be a pressure to deliver. Maintenance teams work with a lot of workload, and so that could also lead to cutting corners. There could be complacent behaviors. People who work on track have been working for decades, and this is their place of work, and that could also lead to a lot of issues because they grow accustomed to all the risks that they see around them. There's also a perception of it won't happen to me, which is something new that's coming to light. But after the incident at Margam in July 2019, there was a perception amongst people that the team at Margam worked in a different way, and that is what led to the incident. And they did. If you read the report, there were a lot of lapses in their work culture. But if you differentiate them from everyone else, then a lot of the times that leads to you turning a blind eye to what could be happening around you. It is important to understand that the team at Margam were experienced staff members who were getting their jobs done, like a lot of people on the railway too. So that's also a perception that that is a bit deceiving, and that's sort of coming up more and more in discussions that I go for or that I'm a part of. There can also be lifestyle impacts of working on track. Everyone who works on track works shifts, and that could be day shifts or night shifts, and that also has certain implications in terms of your health. People work in adverse weather conditions that could lead to slips, trips, or falls. There are also loads of occupational health risks in terms of hand and arm vibration syndromes, or the carpal tunnel syndrome, and that could also lead to distractions in your workplace, or it could be another risk. Then there are also discriminatory practices that can lead to a lack of trust between people in a team, and that could be overdoing banter, not knowing where the line lies, giving into your stereotypical beliefs, promoting or microaggressions, or even just again believing any benevolent prejudices that people have and acting on those. That could just lead to a lack of trust, and that can also create a lot of problems within a team, especially when you're out on site. So to talk a bit more about one of the things that impact safety, I just talk about shift working. So between 2019 and 2022, an average of 47% of our workforce worked morning hours, which are from 6 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Then an average of 35% worked night hours, which is from 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning. So at any given point of time, we have a lot of people who are either out on site or are about to go out on site, and they're constantly being exposed to risks and are being impacted by a lot of external circumstances and things like that. Another worrying trend that's also come up in shift working is there's been a 22% increase in the amount of night hours that are worked between 2019 and 2022. This could be because of a lot of external factors. The pandemic that we've been in for the last 18 months has also impacted this, as well as there has been a shift in how maintenance teams do their work. And so they've had to shift their working times around a bit and work at nights a lot of the times. But all of these factors are or were temporary. I mean, I'm hoping we're at the end of the pandemic now, so this number will go back to what it used to be. And maintenance teams are also settling into their new regimes a lot more now. So you can also see that there has been a decline in that number. So it is still positive. in terms of what impacts and implications come up from shift working, University of Nottingham carried out research on behalf of Network Rail, and what they found out was that there are a lot of risks that are associated with working at nights, and this could lead to an increase in cardiovascular diseases or diabetes, obesity, mental health problems, particularly depression, or even cancer. So it is risky, and we need to do a lot to protect ourselves against that risk. But sometimes we fail, and there are lapses, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So in February of 2017, there was a track worker near miss at Camden Junction, and the investigation said that the recommendations were about improving information about line blockages as well as possessions, and reducing the risk to track workers when they're out on site. In July of 2019, Gareth and Spike lost their lives at Margam, and the recommendations that came out of the investigation done by the Rail Accident and Investigation Board were about the need for organisational changes around maintenance, the refinement of non-technical skills of track workers to improve their soft skills, as well as the reduction of risk that track workers are exposed to when they're working on or near open lines. In April of 2020, Aidan Ashurst was involved in a fatal accident at Road, and the recommendations that came out of that investigation were about understanding and improving the competency of member of staff, as well as understanding their confirmation to make sure that they know what they say they know on paper, as well as minimizing the access to track for track workers. And in June of 2021, Tyler Byrne lost his life at Surbiton, and the investigation for this is still ongoing. And Tyler and his team were working on open lines with protection from train movements. So there was a common theme in the recommendations that have come out, which is about reducing the risk that track workers are exposed to when they're on or near open lines. And there was also an increasing sort of a trend of near misses and incidents, which led to the ORR providing Network Rail with 2 notices to improve their safety that track workers work with and that protect track workers, and that's what we're trying to do at the moment. We're trying to comply with those notices and get as much as we can done. And so in terms of everything that we're doing, I'm going to talk about it from the Safety Task Force's point of view, because that's a team that I spent some time with. So their aim is to ensure that open line working happens with appropriate warning systems. They're also trying to increase additional protection devices that are used to protect track workers even more. And they're trying to simplify the 019 standard, which protects track workers for 100% compliance. There are also some planning strategies that are involved, and this is around promoting proactive planning of work to ensure robustness and to ensure that the plan stays the way it is, even if something goes wrong. Because at the moment, a lot of the work is done with reactive planning, which can also lead to some issues. There's also a strategy around understanding line blockage data and making use of line blockages that are already planned. There are also technological strategies that are involved. This includes using remote disconnection devices to reduce the stress that is put on a signaller to shut the signaling off of a particular section and to make it quick and easy. And there are also track circuit operating devices that are being put into the ground. They're a bit like track circuit clips, but they work with better technology, and they're more intelligent in the sense that you can turn them on and off with an application and things like that. And most importantly, there's a need and a lot of strategy involved in replacing lookout operative warning systems with semi-automatic and automatic track warning systems. And this is just to remove that human error that we expose our railway as well as our people to when we're working with lookouts, and this is a very important strategy that's currently being is in the works. So to talk a bit more about planning, so we're trying to look at line blockages and possessions to increase visibility of this information for track workers, because right now a lot of people might be working in the same area but wouldn't know. So we're trying to increase visibility so that everyone knows what's happening on track at a given point in time. There's also a lot of work being done to package up maintenance standardized tasks with jobs that are already planned and have line blockages and possessions, just to reduce the number of times someone goes out and is on or near the line. There's also a lot of work being done to improve the future of planning, and this is by using intelligent infrastructure to automate planning of tasks. So at the moment, the way work is planned is it's done from Excel sheets and forms, and it's a lot of repetitive work because you have to understand the roster and then match that up with the job and then create a plan. And then it is obviously possible that your plan goes to waste because of something else that has happened, and then so you have to do it again. But if you use intelligent infrastructure, then the plan can be made quickly, and second, it can be changed easily too, and no one has to do repetitive jobs to plan it better or anything like that. There's also a lot of work happening to improve the possession planning system, also known as PPS, to avoid miscommunication in possession planning, because during my conversations with people who are involved in this work, what I found out was that PPS involves a lot of free text, and it gives you that freedom, which means that people can enter things based on their perceptions, and so that can lead to some miscommunication about some key information that needs to be known and needs to be out there. The other thing that we're also doing is about training and competency. So we're trying to improve our standards and update them when standards about planning work. We're also trying to update our training competency for planning, for being a planner, and because traditionally the way it happened was that an existing planner would train a new planner, and that creates another risk in that you might be the best planner, but maybe you're not the best teacher. So we need a formal training process in place, and we need a formal competency and everything. So just so we know that everyone who becomes a planner know everything that they need to know. So that's some of the work that we're doing to improve our planning processes. Because if we do the job in the right way, I mean, if we plan the job in the right way, then we can also go into it with a calm state of mind and get it done calmly. In terms of the technology of it, so I'm going to talk about Sapwires, which is the semi-automatic track warning system. The way it works is that it generates warnings of approaching trains, but by communicating with train detectors, and it provides audible or visual warning, and this needs to be acknowledged by a Sapwires controller, and this is a person who has a competency to acknowledge that warning. And the design of it is that the treadle, which is the image on the top left, sits adjacent to the running rail, and that communicates with the transmitter, which is the image in the middle, and the transmitter then communicates with the warning device. So when the treadle gets activated, you have a warning, an audible and a visual warning go off on the warning device, and that needs to be acknowledged. So it reduces human error by a great measure, and it's really useful, especially when you're thinking about replacing lookout operated warning systems, and it can be installed in different combinations. So it can be a mobile site or a fixed site or a semi-fixed site. There were a lot of challenges that came up with Sapwires. This includes that its asset ownership changed from plant to signaling, which meant that the way it's going to be rolled out and the way it's going to be deployed will change. The signaling standard will be written to cater to signaling requirements, and so a lot of things changed, and that became a challenge for people who are involved in this project. It's also being rolled out nationally. It is a big challenge to do that. There are so many people that need to be involved. There's a lot of work going on, and it is not without its limitations, because Sapwires can't be used where there is no position of safety or POS, or where the site is deemed complex as per its standard, and that leads to some challenges because there are some limitations. But that being said, it still reduces the risk that of lookout work by a great distance and a great margin. And it is also a nice way to move into automatic track warning systems, which reduce that human error even more, because in that you don't have a Sapwires controller who acknowledges the warning. So it's even better. And so that was the end of my presentation. Some final thoughts about safety and the railway is that I think that the railway is really large and complex, and there's a lot that needs to be done, and safety is not easy either. Being a professional who manages safety is complex, and it's not a logical puzzle. It's full of unsafe practices and human error. So when you work with these two things, it is a big challenge. As an example of this challenge, the percentage of outstanding tasks that maintenance teams have has gone up from 4% to 7%. And that is again because of a lot of things that have happened. This is in the last year, and this is the pandemic, which has caused people to work different times, as well as just the changes in maintenance regimes that has come up. And so this is another challenge that we'll soon be tackling, and we can tackle it because we do manage a lot of things on the railway, but it's not all doom and gloom. When I spoke to Nick Millington, who's the head of the safety task force, as well as the president of the PWI, I found out that lookout working is now down to 98% over the last 2 years. And there is a really big push to remove people from unsafe situations and to make people safer and when they're out on track. And all of this work has also pushed everyone to realize that there's a need to have more technology on the railway, to create an intelligent railway and a railway that no one feels unsafe on when they're out there. And for me, that is a really good thing, because as a graduate, I think that is something that I want to create. I want a railway that is safe and intelligent, and I don't want another graduate sort of 20 years down the line. It's also sort of discussing fatalities and near misses and incidents on the railway. So that's also why I did this presentation, just as a thought about that. That was my time. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening, and I hope everyone has a good day.
Saloni, thank you. That was a great presentation, and your passion for the subject is shone through there. So there are some questions in the chat, so I'll relay these to you. Firstly, from Peter Halliwell. So Peter says, Saloni, thank you for your summary of these issues. From your experience, what is your assessment of the attitudes and behaviours of track workers in relation to the systems and processes to keep them safe? How much engagement have you seen so that implementation is done by and not done to?
Thank you for your question, Peter. I think from what I've seen in terms of the attitudes that people have, it's a very wide range. There is a disconnect between people who are actually out on site and people who try and protect them. So there is that disconnect between the two people involved in the two teams. It's some people understand the need for everything that's being done and the systems that are there to keep them safe, but some people also sort of see it as a bit excessive. And the reason that belief exists is not because they think it's actually excessive, but it's just because they're overworked, and so they don't have that time or the capacity in them to understand why that process exists, and that becomes a challenge. It is a big thing, because I think it's all about balancing all the risks, and it's about balancing everything that goes on in a person's mind, which is why I think safety also becomes a complex topic, because there's so much that you need to manage, the people who work out on site, or who are on track, or who are planning that thing, or anything like that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Saloni. And then I've got another question from Liam Jackson, who says, asks Saloni, what is your view on how effective Network Rail is at learning from accidents and incidents? Are we good at closing out and implementing actions found, for example, in level 1 and 2 investigations?
I think, again, it's there's a bit of disconnect. I think some people are very good in learning from accidents and investigations, and some people, I mean, especially, for example, I've had a lot of conversations about Margam and what happened there, and with some people, they learn so much from that one incident and they have so much to take home. But there are also a lot of people who have that perception of, oh, it won't happen to me. And I think it's just about how that information gets trickled down, because you might have someone who learns a lot from that, but also that maybe that person has that capacity to learn a lot, and for them, being out on the track is a risk and is scary, so they spend that time thinking about it. But if it's a person who goes out every day, they might not learn from it. So it's about how you make sure that information gets relayed to everyone, and everyone has that space and the capacity to take that in. I think that's my take on it. Yeah,
good. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good insight there. Thank you, Saloni. Great presentation. And if there are any more questions again that come through on the chat, we'll relay them at the end of this session. But thank you for now.
Yep. Yeah. It sounds good. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Gareth. Thank you.
That just leaves me to hand over to our final presenter this afternoon, Nikersh Palaninaath. Nikersh, apologies, I didn't receive a sort of summary of your presentation, so I'll let you introduce it, as well as introduce yourself and your background in Network Rail, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Gareth. Hi everyone, so I'm Nikersh. I'm also a graduate electrical engineer. Joined Network Rail back in September 2020. So I'm a second year grad, and I'm just completing my maintenance placement. And today my presentation is on workforce and workplace diversity and inclusion. So I just thought I'd talk a bit about, the experience, what I've had between the office and like the depot, and to see what you guys think. And also as like a little summary for like future grads, so they can see what they're expecting. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, that's okay, Nikersh. Thanks.
Yeah.
You can see it.
Cool. Right. So firstly, like difference in culture, North versus South. So I actually did a summer internship at Network Rail in York. So the kind of difference, this is what I've found, and this is just my experience, but the culture in London is completely different to the culture anywhere else in the UK. And why is that? It's because I feel like people from all kinds of culture and background working together. I feel like there's more culture in London and just kind of like secludes as you go towards the north, and there's less diversity in the workplace, especially in like maintenance depots. I feel like London maintenance depots are like one of the most diversified group of people compared to the rest of the country. And in terms of controversy of hierarchy, there's also bits that come into play where when you're a graduate and you come into the work, when you go into your maintenance placement, you start working in like a depot, there are like, section supervisors, there are people who've been working there for like 20-25 years, but they've got 25 years worth of experience and knowledge, but they might not have a degree. So that might, unlike the hierarchy, it might put you above them, but they may consume so much more knowledge than you, and you can learn so much from them. So just accepting as a graduate, accepting that you're basically starting from scratch, and you've got so much to learn. Having that kind of mentality really helps, because that helps you get along with all the people in the depot and just learn from their knowledge. Because because I think that's one of the most important mindset to have, is to learn from your placement. And one of the most important thing is how we learn is by talking to people and talking about their experience, which will help you. Then the difference in ethnicities and in office versus track. So I'm comparing a scenario where you can go into the quadrant, and what you may find in the quadrant versus what you may find on track or like depot offices. In the office, you're more likely to find a more diverse group of people than on track. Hence, you might find it a bit harder to find people from your background or culture while working on track. And track staff are usually way more chatty and laid back compared to like a formal office environment. You'd find that the chats you have at, like, if you're, let's say you're working in the fall team for a couple of weeks, the chat you have with the fall team would not be the kind of chat you have in a formal office environment before like a team meeting in like the quadrant or whatever. And it's more of, it's very laid back. So, you know, people kind of, how do you say this? Like in a very informal way, like they kind of like, you know, make fun of people, and it's just for jokes and giggles. But yeah, it's very laid back and compared to the office. So it really depends. So if you're a new graduate going into like maintenance depots, just always make sure that, you know, you're not kind of looking for something like in the office. So you just have to be ready, and kind of be prepared to just be a bit more laid back and more chatty than what you would usually be. But that's my little tip. Then different culture in talking and interacting. You'd find that office chats are usually very formal, unlike chats you have while you're working at the depot. Conversations held on track are usually more laid back and less formal. Although I must mention, like safety related discussions are very formal, and you know it's very strict. So before you indulge in any track work, there's always a cost that's assigned, and you have safety related discussions, and they make sure you know what kind of work you're going to be working on and what to watch out for if there's a train that's going to come, and you know what kind of signal they're going to use to let you know when to get off the track. Then usually when interacting with people at the office, you tend to have more gentle banter, but on track this might not be the case. But it also depends on what kind of which depot you're working on, what kind of people you're working with. The banter could get a little like extreme in like maintenance depots, but as long as you don't, you know, take it too hard and you just banter back with them, I think you're in a good place. And in my opinion, honestly, I think people at the depot have probably been one of the most fun people I've met, just because you form a really close relationship with the people you work with at the depot. And that's just my personal experience, talking about it again. And how have I handled the change? Have I been integrated into teams differently? Have I changed the way I interact with teams to fit in? How is the workplace banter different? So let me just explain one by one. I have integrated into teams differently, but that doesn't mean I have changed the way how I interact, because I think you should not change yourself. You should always be yourself wherever you go. So just as long as you just have to be a bit flexible, you know, because different teams obviously have a different dynamic. So you just have to kind of engage engage the atmosphere of the team and kind of be a bit flexible. So obviously the chat I would have at the depot office wouldn't be the exact same discussion I'll be having with, like, you know, my seniors at the office, like my line manager and stuff. It's obviously a bit different, but you know, as long as you can tackle the change and adapt yourself to the environment without changing yourself, I think that's the best way to fit in. And how is the workplace banter different between office and track? If I may use the informal word, I'd say at like depot offices, they tend to make fun of you or like roast you, you know, just as in a really very, very friendly manner. But that would never happen in the office environment. So that, I think that's the major difference. And as long as you can, you know, kind of click with the people in the depot, that's all good. But sometimes, you know, this may not be right for you, and you may not be a very like flexible person. It really depends on the kind of person you are. So obviously, if you feel uneasy in any way, you should always talk to them and, you know, kind of explain where you're coming from and tell them, you know, there's always, and also there's always a line in terms even bantering. So always be yourself, treat everybody like including you equally and with respect. And if you ever think the banter in a depot office or even like a normal formal quadrant office environment is out of line, you should always have the confidence to kind of, stand up and tell them, right, like that's not right, this is wrong. Always have the confidence to express how you feel. And if you don't feel right with the right team, you should always get support from like your seniors and, tell them how you really feel, because some people may adapt to it, some people may not. So it's all about talking and making sure you're comfortable where you are. That's the suggestion I have for grads entering, like in the future, into their maintenance placement, because I feel like if you've never been into a depot before, you probably go into a depot with the mindset of, oh, it's just going to be another office, but it is entirely different. But yeah. Then also trying to avoid unconscious bias. An example of unconscious bias is, even though track workers may seem less well-spoken, they're still very intelligent at solving problems, fault finding, and good at doing their job. Just because they do not have like, a college degree or a master's degree or whatnot, but they've worked on the railway for like 25, 30 years. They may know stuff maybe some of the senior engineers or PRE might not know, because they're just so good at their job, because they've been doing doing the same thing for the last 25 years. So yeah, never assume someone may not know something, because I found that the people I work at the depot, they just know exactly what's wrong. Like even if you go on a fault finding job, before we even get there, they know, okay, what it's going to be, because that's been their job for like 25 years. Then challenging culture, confidence to challenge in the workplace on language such as towards LGBTQ plus communities, and being aware of your banter. So obviously, always make sure that no one's getting hurt in any sort of discussions you may have, informal or formal, in office environments or depot environments. If you think someone's crossing a line, you need to be that person to set an example and talk up and say, yes, that's wrong. You shouldn't be saying that, and putting people back into their place, kind of thing. Because sometimes someone may say something rude that could affect someone else, and may not affect you. But even if that is the case, you should speak up, and speak up for your colleague as well. Inclusiveness. This is one of the slides I got from another colleague of mine in the graduate, also in the graduate cohort. So comparison between my perspective and that of the others to be more inclusive could be a simple glance at someone else's Outlook calendar and inclusive thoughts about religious prayer times, time for carers. So for example, I think we were scheduled in a specific team meeting once, and I think it was during the month of like Ramadan, or during like a Friday prayer thing, prayer time, and some of the graduates couldn't attend that meeting because it was kind of clashing into their religious prayer times. So just an example is that always maybe even look at the Outlook calendar, or always ask people before just shooting across an invite for a meeting, so that you're not like not counting their tasks of the day in. So always make everybody feel included, and ask people like if they're free for a meeting before you schedule it, and they do not have any other commitments, because everybody has commitments these days, and it could be anything. So just always make everybody feel inclusive. Creating a more inclusive atmosphere on both sides, just spreading positivity, treating everybody equally, punctuality, and then always being prepared. Volunteer to get your hands dirty. Don't just observe just because you're a graduate, and respect everybody. So one of the things I've realized is, if you go into the depot office as a graduate, they're always like, treating you with respect, and because they think you're gonna be on one of the top positions after you leave the placement, and you could possibly even be their line manager one day. So they try not to make you do any work, but by being that person, you're not going to learn. The only way you're going to learn is, just volunteering to do some of the work, whether it might be like tightening like bolts, or even just refilling like a hydraulic fluid on the track, or even like in a points failure, just assuming like don't just stand there in your oranges as a graduate and just see like look what's happening, but make sure you learn from them and what exactly they're doing, so that one day when you become like a senior engineer or an asset engineer or whatnot, you know exactly what's going on. You just don't, and even if there was nobody else, that you could do it by yourself. So, and they really respect that, like the supervisors and the technicians who you work with at the depot, they really respect that if you do get your hands dirty. And that's one way to also gain respect within the team. That's one of the little tip I had for the grads. And always ask questions. Remember, you're always there to learn, collaborate with everybody. And there's always this little stigma where it's like, graduates versus apprentices. They always treat graduates a bit like higher with respect than apprentices, just because they think graduates are gonna, go up the ladder quicker, and one day they're gonna be looking after them. But make sure, just like when I was working with an apprentice, I made sure both of us received the same equal treatment as in what work we did, and in terms of respect, everything. That always sometimes people might ask the apprentice to do the work, and for the graduate to just sit and watch, which is really unfair. So it shouldn't be that way. It should always be equal. So step up and do the work. Make sure everybody's treated equally. And last but not least, enjoy the work you do, because as a graduate, you're here to learn, and your entire 6 months in that maintenance is to make sure you learn everything you can. So yeah, sorry it was brief, but that's me. That's me. That's my time. Cheers. Hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikersh. Fascinating feedback there on your experience as a graduate in Network Rail in those different environments. While there's a question from Liam Jackson, Nikersh, before I come on to a couple of questions I've got. So he said, a really honest assessment. Thank you, Nikersh. I'm glad you've had a positive experience on your placements, but I have a feeling not everyone may have had the same. Perhaps you could deliver this talk to the next cohort of graduates.
Oh yeah, I'd be more than happy to deliver this. If you could just give me more information as to when and where, I'd be happy to help.
Yeah, I think building on what you've done, it would be really useful for the next intake to hear of your experiences and some of the ways you've taken the opportunity with both hands and got the most out of those placements, as well as coping with some of the other situations that might not be quite so comfortable at times. And Peter Hallowell has said, "Hi Nikersh, thanks. Lots of heartfelt advice in your talk. The general comments took me back to my time as a trainee nearly 40 years ago. So there you go, you've helped several of us on the call relive our own experiences as new entrants to the industry. I wanted to ask Nikersh, where do you think Network Rail should focus its efforts in future in terms of developing a more inclusive workforce, a more inclusive business, and whether that's different in kind of the office type jobs that we do, or the frontline jobs that we do, as you've mentioned in your presentation?
Are you talking only about office space, or
a bit of both? Yeah. What do you think? Is there a difference, or is it?
I think from my experience in the graduate program, as I'm closing to my 2 years of my graduate program, I feel like as graduates, we've been, treated absolutely amazingly by the graduate team and technical authority. So, and in terms of being inclusive, they've always considered, because the graduate team has specific technical trainings for all the graduates. So they always keep in mind that we've got other stuff going on as well, like whether it might be a placement we're working on. So I think one tip would be, some people may assume like graduates will always be free kind of thing. Or they're always like, here to help, like always be free. But there's sometimes it's just like we also have different like working patterns, because some graduates may be doing night shifts, some graduates may be doing like early morning shifts at like maintenance and stuff. So I think I'm kind of getting backtracked, but your question is, how can you make them feel more inclusive? Is it?
Yeah, it's really around from what you've experienced over the last 2 years. Where do you think Network Rail should focus its efforts in becoming a more inclusive business?
Right. So I think in terms of like some of the work teams, some of the teams I worked in, I usually am the only graduate that is there in a team, or even at the depot, I'm the only graduate there. It would be nice to see a couple more graduates in the team to work with, because most of the time, when I talk to people, even in my cohort, everyone's obviously divided into separate routes, separate teams. But most of the time, in one team, it's one graduate. They take only one graduate for a team or a route, that specific team, really. It would be nicer to work with more graduates, because you'll have someone to work with, from your background, from your in your age, because it's otherwise you're the only graduate, and let's say if you want to seek help, it will always be like we're seeking help from our seniors who may be more busy, who may not have that much time to spend on graduates as well. So that's one thing I'd maybe like to say, like, having more graduates in the team you're working with, that would be nice. But, yeah.
So an opportunity to kind of connect more with other graduates and discuss some of the issues. Great,
Yeah.
thank you, Nico. So a really fantastic presentation to finish off. Three great, thought-provoking talks today. I'm going to hand over, ask Beth Quayle to join us to give the vote of thanks in the usual way. Can't hear you, Beth, yet. Maybe, Beth, I've broken the system by asking you to join us without setting up this in advance. So maybe you're off the hook this time.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, that's better. Great. Off you go.
Oh, excellent. Sorry. My apologies, everyone. Yeah, no, thanks, Gareth. And yeah, really big thank you to the three presenters today. Yeah, I've personally really enjoyed all the presentations. As someone who started off as a graduate in the technical authority, I think, it's really inspiring to see some of our newer engineers looking to tackle, I think, well, to summarise, probably three of the really big challenges I'd say that are facing the rail industry. Environmental challenges, safety, and diversity and inclusion. So yeah, I thought Armeila's presentation really interesting on the use of off-grid renewables for the level crossings, and the really in-depth analysis that she's done behind that to put forward her proposal. I thought Saloni's presentation, again, really interesting, looking at some of the analysis behind the issues, and also some of the solutions being both the technical and the people side of safety, because I think, as she recognised, it's not just one of those, it's the combination of the two. And yeah, Nikersh, I think some really honest feedback from your experience, and definitely some things that resounded with me with that, in terms of making sure that you make the most of opportunities to learn from others, and also yeah, just making the most of every opportunity whilst you're in different environments and different work environments. So yeah, just again, really big thank you to the three presenters. I'd echo your thoughts, Gareth. Thought really thought-provoking and really well delivered presentations. So thanks again.
Lovely, thanks, Beth. So that rounds up today's session. I will just advertise briefly before we all drop off the call that our next talk is covering light rail engineering and the tram train interface. So one of the TA team delivering that one. Ian Ambrose, who's got a wealth of experience in that field, and I believe that will be on the 14th of April, but we'll confirm that in the usual way through the sort of the bulletins and emails between now and then. So thanks for joining all. Thanks again to our presenters. Really, really great contributions, and see you all soon. Take care.